The house was quiet, far too quiet for a woman who once knew it filled with laughter, footsteps, and her son's booming voice echoing down the hall. Margaret sat in her worn armchair, hands folded tightly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the radio, perched on the old oak table. The radio wasn't fancy, just a simple piece of equipment her husband once used to tinker with before he passed. Now it had become her entire world. Outside, the night hummed with the chorus of cicadas. A summer breeze rustled the leaves of the old maple tree in the yard, brushing shadows across the window. The world outside moved on effortlessly, unconcerned, with the turmoil that consumed her heart. But inside, the air was heavy, weighted with expectation. Margaret's fingers hovered over the dials, adjusting them carefully, as though each twist carried the power to bring her son closer. Static filled the room, an unending sea of white noise, but she listened with intent. To anyone else, it was meaningless sound. To her, it was possibility, a canvas where hope could be painted. Her son, Daniel, was thousands of miles away, serving. With the Navy SEALs, he had left 2 years earlier, carrying the weight of both duty and silence. The military sent occasional letters, each one brief, carefully worded, scrubbed clean of any detail that might compromise security. They always arrived weeks late, wrinkled from travel, and written in Daniel's rushed scrawl. They gave little away, but Margaret read them as though they were holy scripture, memorizing every word, every stroke of his pen. But letters weren't enough. The radio was her anchor, her ritual, her battlefield. Every evening after supper, she would switch it on, lean close, and wait. She told no one of this vigil, not even her closest friends. They already thought her obsessive, unable to move on with life while Daniel was overseas. "You'll make yourself sick," they warned. "That radio won't bring him home." But Margaret didn't listen. She remembered her son's last night home, his arms around her, his whisper soft but steady. "If you're listening, I'll find a way." Those words had lodged themselves into her soul. So she listened. The first nights were the hardest, when nothing but empty static filled the air. Each crackle felt like a cruel tease, as if life itself mocked her devotion. But as weeks turned to months, Margaret found comfort in the routine. She rose each morning, baked bread or tended to her garden, exchanged polite smiles with neighbors at the market, and then returned home to prepare for her nightly vigil. The act of turning on the radio, of waiting beside it, gave her life structure. The radio became more than a machine. It became her prayer. Sometimes she imagined Daniel's voice, breaking through, calling her name across the static. Other times she dreamed of a simple tone, a sign she could recognize as his. It was foolish, perhaps, but love made room for foolishness. What others saw as madness, Margaret saw as faith. At night, when exhaustion pulled at her, she refused to leave the chair. She would rest her head against the cushion, eyes half closed, but never fully surrendering to sleep. She was afraid the moment she drifted off, she'd miss the very signal she was waiting for. Better to lose sleep than risk losing hope. There were moments of weakness, of course. Nights when the static felt like a wall between her and her son. Nights when she clutched the radio and sobbed, whispering prayers into the void. She begged God, the universe, anyone who might listen, to keep Daniel safe. And when the tears dried, she straightened her back, wiped her eyes, and turned the dial again. Her neighbors didn't understand. They pitied her, whispered about her behind curtains. Some even tried to console her, urging her to let go, to accept the uncertainty of war. Margaret nodded politely, but their words slid past her like rain. On glass, they didn't know Daniel. They didn't know the bond between a mother and son. Daniel had been her only child, born late in her marriage after years of heartbreak. From the moment she held him, Margaret knew her life had been given purpose. She remembered his first steps, his scraped knees, the way he used to sit at the kitchen table, scribbling drawings of battleships while she cooked. He had always been fascinated by service, by sacrifice, by something bigger than himself. And when he told her he wanted to join the SEALs, she swallowed her fear and smiled, because she knew she couldn't clip his wings. But when the door closed behind him, her heart broke. The radio became her way of keeping him close. She imagined him somewhere in the desert or jungle, whispering into a transmitter, sending signals that only she could decode. It wasn't logical, she knew that. But love doesn't need logic. Love needs hope. Every creak in the house reminded her of him. The smell of bread baking reminded her of his appetite as a boy. Even the silence of the night carried his presence. And always the radio hummed, filling the void he left behind. There were times she questioned herself, wondering if she truly heard something within the static. A faint pattern, a rhythm that didn't belong. Once, late at night, she swore she heard a series of beeps, short and deliberate. Her heart raced, but then the sound vanished, leaving her with only uncertainty. Was it Daniel? Or just the randomness of static? She chose to believe it was him, because belief was all she had. Margaret began to measure time not by days or seasons, but by nights spent beside the radio. Each vigil was a thread in the tapestry of her waiting. Each whisper of static was another heartbeat of faith. And though the world outside her door carried on, neighbors laughed, children grew, wars were debated in newsrooms inside her home, time stood still. It revolved around one unbroken circle. The moment she switched on the radio, the moment she leaned forward, and the endless stretch of waiting that followed. Waiting became her strength. Waiting became her love made visible. And deep in her heart, she knew this. One day, the radio would answer. One day, the static would break. One day, Daniel's promise, "If you're listening, I'll find a way," would be fulfilled. Until then, Margaret waited, faithful, unyielding, a soldier in her own right, fighting a battle of patience and love beside the glow of an old oak table and the hum of the radio that carried the weight of a son's life. The mornings came slowly for Margaret, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over a house where hope and worry had taken root. She would wake with her neck stiff from the armchair, the faint hum of the radio still echoing in her ears. The nights were long, restless, but she always forced herself into the rhythm of the day. It was the only way she knew how to survive. Her routine became sacred. Coffee brewed as dawn painted the horizon. She knelt by her small garden, pulling weeds with a sharpness that reflected her inner unrest. Neighbors would wave, offering kind, but hollow smiles. Margaret waved back, though her eyes carried a depth they couldn't understand. They saw a woman stubbornly clinging to a machine, but she saw herself as a soldier on the home front, keeping vigil while her son fought battles. Across the sea, letters from the military came rarely, and when they did, they were laced with a coldness that made Margaret's chest ache. The envelopes arrived stamped with official seals, their contents stripped of humanity by the hands of censors. She would tear them open with trembling fingers, hungry for Daniel's words, but her heart would sink as she read the clipped sentences. All is well. Training continues. Stay strong. Sometimes entire lines were blacked out, replaced by thick strokes of ink that reminded her of scars. Margaret read them anyway. She studied the slant of his handwriting, the pressure of his pen, searching for hidden meaning. She told herself that his pauses, the unevenness of certain words, were proof he missed her, proof he longed for home. She tucked each letter carefully into a shoebox under her bed, treating it like treasure. Yet even with the letters, silence pressed in on her life like a heavy fog. To fight it, she baked. The kitchen became her battlefield, flour dusting her counters like snow, the smell of yeast rising in the air. She kneaded dough with clenched fists, pushing her worry into the pliant mass. Each loaf was shaped by longing, baked in ovens of hope. When she pulled them out, golden and fragrant, she would imagine Daniel breaking a piece, laughing at her fussiness, telling her it was too warm to eat yet. But bread couldn't quiet the ache, so at night she returned to the radio. Margaret would set the loaf aside, wipe her hands on her apron, and settle back into her chair. She turned the dials slowly, reverently, listening for anything unusual. The static filled the room again, constant, unforgiving. Some nights it sounded like the ocean crashing endlessly against a shore. Other nights it was a swarm of bees, angry and restless. But always she listened. Her neighbors began to whisper more openly. On market days, she overheard them as she selected apples or milk. "Poor woman," one said softly. "Still sitting there every night, waiting for something that isn't coming." Another shook her head. "She's lost herself in that radio. Grief has taken her mind," Margaret heard them. The words stung, but she carried them like stones in her pocket, heavy yet bearable. They didn't understand. How could they? Their sons were safe, tucked into beds down the street, not crawling through deserts with rifles on their backs. Their children's voices filled their kitchens each evening, while hers was carried only in memory. If clinging to the radio was madness, then Margaret welcomed it. Because it wasn't madness, it was devotion. One evening, a storm swept across the town. Rain battered the windows. Thunder rattled the panes. The radio crackled angrily, its static louder than usual, distorted by the storm's electricity. Margaret sat forward, her heart racing, every sense alive. She had read somewhere that storms could carry signals farther, bending them across distances. Impossible under clear skies. She believed, in that moment, that perhaps the storm was her ally. Her hands tightened on the armrests. Her ears strained through the noise. She whispered Daniel's name, almost afraid to disturb the fragile line of sound. But nothing came, only more static, more chaos. Her heart sank, but she did not move. She stayed until the storm passed, her vigil unbroken. Afterward, when the storm cleared and the cicadas returned, she thought of Daniel. Was he listening too? Was he crouched somewhere in darkness, waiting for a chance to send his message? The thought gave her strength. She had to believe the silence was temporary, that signals were traveling even now, struggling through miles of sky and interference. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Margaret learned to live with the rhythm of waiting. She marked time, not with calendars, but with the ritual of listening. Each night was another chance, another test of her endurance. And though she never admitted it out loud, she felt Daniel's presence in the static. It was as though the noise carried his heartbeat, faint but steady. Sometimes she dreamed of him as a boy, his laughter echoing down the hall. Other times she dreamed of him as the man he had become, strong and determined, carrying burdens she could only imagine. These dreams bled into her waking hours, and she often found herself speaking aloud while adjusting the dials. "I'm here," she would say softly. "I'm listening." And in those moments, the static didn't feel empty. It felt alive. The loneliness was heavy, yes. The silence often cruel. But the radio gave her something precious, purpose. While others tried to console her with platitudes, Margaret clung to her nightly ritual, believing she was doing more than waiting. She was holding the line. She was keeping the promise alive. And deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and exhaustion, Margaret carried a truth she could not explain. The signal would come. Not today, not tomorrow, perhaps not even this year, but it would come. And when it did, she would be ready. So she waited faithfully every night beside the radio. The desert stretched endlessly before Daniel, its ochre sands shifting like waves in a restless ocean. The sun beat down relentlessly, a fiery orb scorching everything it touched, while the wind carried dust that cut like sandpaper against his skin. Sweat clung to his uniform, mixing with dirt, and yet he moved forward with quiet determination. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, every glance scanning the horizon for threats invisible to those untrained in war. He remembered home, her kitchen, warm with the smell of bread, her hands covered in flour as she fussed over every detail. That memory was armor, a shield against the weariness gnawing at his body. At night, he closed his eyes and imagined Margaret, sitting beside the radio, fingers on the dials, waiting. It was a strange comfort, picturing her vigil across oceans, her unwavering faith threading across the distance between them. The team moved in silence, communicating in subtle gestures, their weapons ever ready. They were ghosts in the desert, shadows slipping across dunes, invisible, yet unbreakable. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Each mission demanded focus, courage, and sacrifice beyond measure. Friends had fallen, some never returning, their absence a haunting echo in the team's movements. Daniel carried their memory forward, honoring them with precision, discipline, and sheer determination to survive. In rare moments of stillness, he would reach into his backpack and pull out a small notebook, pages worn and edges frayed. There, he scribbled thoughts he would never send, letters to his mother that might never be read, sketches of the home he longed for. He wrote of the desert nights, the firelight in distant villages, the sky so vast it swallowed his smallness. But most importantly, he wrote promises. One promise was foremost. If he survived, she would know. The team had received instructions to coordinate an extraction, but Daniel had quietly negotiated an additional detail with the communications officer. A simple signal, 3 short tones, nothing more. Margaret would recognize it instantly, and no one else would. It wasn't much, but it would tell her he was alive. That thought, that single hope, became the light guiding him through endless trials. Days and nights blurred into one another. The desert was unforgiving, and Daniel felt the relentless pressure of survival. Food was scarce, water scarcer. Every step had to be calculated. Every action weighed against danger. Even minor mistakes could mean death, and yet his thoughts never strayed from his mother. Every mission, every brush with danger, reinforced the urgency of the signal he had promised her. He remembered the last night at home, the smell of pine. From the Christmas tree, the soft glow of lights reflecting in her eyes as she pressed a warm hand to his cheek. "Be careful," she had whispered, her voice steady even as it trembled. "I'll be waiting." Those words had become his mantra. They played in his mind with the rhythm of a heartbeat, constant and unyielding. In the evenings, when darkness fell and his team rested in hidden encampments, Daniel would take a moment to close his eyes and imagine the radio's hum. He pictured his mother leaning forward, her hands adjusting dials, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the indicator lights. He imagined her whispering to the static, "I'm listening, Daniel." Always listening. The thought filled him with both longing and courage. Each mission brought its own dangers, landmines, enemy patrols, treacherous terrain, and the ever-present uncertainty of war. But Daniel moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed survival 1,000 times over. His body was conditioned to endurance. His mind was sharpened for strategy. But his heart remained tethered to home, pulled by a string only Margaret could maintain. The nights were hardest. Camped under a blanket of stars, Daniel would lie awake, listening to the desert's strange nocturnal symphony, the howl of distant coyotes, the sigh of the wind through jagged rocks, the faint murmur of life persisting against all odds. And in the midst of it all, he imagined the faintest whisper of the radio back home, the crackle that would announce he had survived another day. He shared little with his team about Margaret. They were brothers in arms, yes, but their bonds were forged in immediacy, the fire of danger, the need for trust in a single moment. They respected family, of course, but the delicate hope tethering Daniel to a woman thousands of miles away was private, sacred, and vulnerable. Only in the notebook he carried in secret did he allow the truth to flow, the love that propelled him, the promise that kept him moving, and the silent communication he would someday send. The team spoke in grunts and nods. Laughter was rare, smiles rarer. Each of them carried their own anchors, their own memories of home. Daniel's was Margaret, waiting by a radio. In his mind, she was a fortress, a lighthouse, a beacon through the fog of war. Each day, each night, each grueling step across sand and stone, he imagined sending her a single unmistakable signal. 3 short tones, that was all. But for Margaret, it would mean the world. Time became a strange thing. The sun burned relentlessly, then disappeared behind crimson horizons. Nights stretched on like rivers of darkness. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at Daniel's body, but his spirit remained intact. He rehearsed silently how the signal would be sent, timing each short beep in his mind. The pattern had to be perfect. Precision was critical. Margaret's faith depended on it. In rare moments, the team would rest around small fires, shadows dancing against sand and rock. Daniel would drift into his memories, recalling summers in his mother's kitchen, the smell of freshly baked bread, the softness of her hands. He remembered small moments, a cup of cocoa, the feel of a sweater she had knit for him, the way her voice rose and fell in gentle rhythm as she read stories aloud. These were fragments of normalcy in a world gone mad. At times, he imagined her frustration, her worry for him, the loneliness of nights spent waiting. His heart ached, but it also strengthened him. He would endure because she waited. He would survive because she believed. And one day, when the war allowed, he would send the signal she was waiting for. 3 short, simple tones, proof that he was alive, proof that hope endured. Every step, every decision, carried that weight. He moved with care, aware that a single miscalculation could mean death. And yet, the thought of Margaret's waiting eyes, her unwavering faith, gave him courage beyond reason. The desert, the sand, the scorching sun, and the endless dangers were secondary to that one truth. She was waiting, and he would not fail her. In the quietest moments, Daniel would whisper into the darkness, "I will find a way. I will reach you." He believed it with every fiber of his being. And though no sound traveled across the miles to her, though no signal yet left the desert night, he felt the connection. The bond was unbroken. And one day, he promised himself, that bond would be made real. The days grew longer for Margaret, yet the nights stretched like endless rivers of shadow and uncertainty. The sun rose and fell, painting the walls of her small living room in muted tones, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were always drawn to the radio. It sat on the oak table as if it were a sentinel, its hum a constant companion. Every evening, Margaret would wipe her hands on her apron, adjust the antenna, and lean forward with a quiet intensity that made the air in the room tremble with expectation. Sometimes the radio was cruel. The static crackled relentlessly, filling the space with a noise that was at once comforting and maddening. On stormy nights, the interference grew stronger, lightning striking distant hills and sending tremors through the device. Margaret would lean closer, straining to catch patterns in the chaos, listening for even the faintest whisper. Her heart raced with anticipation, only to fall when the signal dissolved into ordinary noise. She would close her eyes, take a deep breath, and remind herself, patience, patience, and faith. Margaret's house had grown quiet in ways she hadn't anticipated. The garden, once full of life, flourished under her care, yet it felt hollow. Meals were cooked and eaten alone. Friends tried to visit, bringing small tokens and sympathetic smiles, but she waved them away gently. They couldn't understand that she wasn't lonely. She was vigilant. They saw a woman clinging to a relic, but Margaret saw a mother guarding her son's life across an ocean of danger. Letters from the military remained infrequent and frustratingly vague. Each one felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. Lines were redacted in thick black ink. Dates and locations were left vague, leaving her imagination to fill the void. Some days she would reread old letters, tracing the lines of Daniel's handwriting with a trembling finger, memorizing every curve, every space between words. She convinced herself she could feel his presence through the paper, a tether stronger than steel. Sometimes, Margaret allowed herself brief moments of despair. She would stand by the window, staring into the night, imagining what could have gone wrong. Every flash of lightning, every distant siren, every unusual sound outside made her heart clench. Her mind spun scenarios of danger, of loss, of messages never sent. She fought these thoughts fiercely, silencing them with whispered prayers and the ritual of turning the radio's dial. I am listening, Daniel. Always listening. The nights became almost ceremonial. Margaret prepared herself, as though stepping into a sacred space. She poured tea, even if she didn't drink it. She lit a small candle, the flame flickering against the darkened walls, casting dancing shadows that reminded her of movement, of life. She sat with her back straight, hands poised over the radio, waiting for that moment of connection that might never come. And yet she never left. Even exhaustion couldn't pull her from the vigil. Sometimes she thought she heard it 3 soft tones buried within the static, but they always vanished before she could be certain. Each false alarm twisted her stomach in knots, yet she didn't allow disappointment to linger. She would pause, close her eyes, and breathe deeply, reminding herself of her son's words. If you're listening, I'll find a way. That mantra became a rhythm in her mind, a heartbeat she could synchronize with her own. Margaret had learned to exist in the liminal space between hope and fear. Days were filled with mundane tasks, with gardening, cleaning, baking, and paying bills. Nights were for waiting, for listening, for imagining that somewhere, in a desert far away, Daniel was alive and thinking of her. The monotony of daily life contrasted sharply with the intensity of her vigil, but it was a balance she had learned to embrace. Each action during the day was a preparation for night, each meal a rehearsal for endurance. The neighbors noticed her dedication, often commenting quietly among themselves. She spends every night by that radio, one whispered to another. I don't know how she does it. They marveled and pitied her in equal measure. Margaret paid them no mind. Their understanding wasn't necessary. Their approval was irrelevant. Her purpose was singular, her mission clear. She was a guardian at the edge of impossibility, holding on to a fragile line between despair and hope. On certain nights, Margaret allowed herself to speak to the static, whispering words she knew her son could never hear directly. I'm here, Daniel. I've always been here. Her voice shook sometimes, carrying more weight than the room could bear, but she continued. The radio became her confessional, her companion, her bridge to a world beyond sight and touch. In these moments, she wasn't waiting idly. She was active, engaged, a mother's heart pounding in rhythm with unseen signals. There were rituals she adopted to maintain focus. She would adjust the dials in a particular order, listening to each frequency with painstaking attention. She would tap her fingers on the table, counting in silent sequences, trying to imagine the pattern her son might use. She even hummed songs they had shared in his childhood, as if the vibrations might carry across the miles, comforting him even unknowingly. Every gesture, every action was a reinforcement of her commitment. The stormy nights were the most trying. Lightning arced across the sky, thunder rattled the walls, and the static became almost unbearable in its intensity. Margaret would hold her breath during these times, listening, straining to find meaning. The radio was alive with interference, yet she persisted. Some nights she thought she heard a tone that sounded deliberate, but it faded too quickly to be sure. Her pulse would race, hope surging, only to be replaced by cautious disappointment. And still she waited. Sleep became a stranger. Margaret would nod off briefly, only to wake with a start, convinced she had missed the moment, the sound, the signal. Even in her dreams, she saw Daniel, distant and smiling faintly, waving to her from unfamiliar terrain. These dreams fueled her resolve. When she woke, she would immediately reach for the radio, adjusting dials, listening for the faintest hint of life. She could not surrender to exhaustion. Doing so might mean missing the one proof she longed for. Margaret's body ached from months of vigilance, yet her spirit remained unbroken. Her eyes had grown weary from staring, her hands stiff from constant adjustment of dials, yet her determination never wavered. She had grown into the role of sentinel, a watchful presence guarding a fragile thread connecting her to her son. Her life was no longer measured by ordinary time. It was measured by minutes of listening, seconds of hope, and the unending patience of waiting for a signal she could scarcely describe, yet believed she would recognize. Even in solitude, she felt a connection to the world. The hum of the cicadas, the shifting of the wind, the faint sounds of distant traffic all became markers in her vigil. Each sound was filtered through her awareness, each interruption a test of patience. Her life outside the radio felt unreal secondary. The radio was the axis around which her existence rotated, and through it, she felt a closeness to Daniel that distance could not sever. Her friends continued to worry. Some tried to encourage her to rest, to eat, to sleep. Others spoke gently, of accepting uncertainty, of moving forward. But Margaret politely refused, retreating to her vigil without argument. They did not understand that this waiting was not a passive act. It was a labor of love, an active engagement with hope, a defiance against the crushing weight of absence. She would not let distance, danger, or time diminish her commitment. And deep down, Margaret knew she was not waiting in vain. There was a certainty, quiet but unshakable, that one day the radio would speak to her. The static would shift. 3 short tones, deliberate and unmistakable, would break the silence. And in that moment, all the nights of waiting, all the yes of waiting, fear, all the longing would coalesce into relief so profound it would make her knees buckle. Until that moment came, she waited, faithful, fierce, unbroken, every night. Every hour, every breath taken beside the radio reinforced a truth she had carried for months. That love could traverse oceans, that hope could survive deserts, and that a mother's vigilance was a force no war could diminish. And so Margaret waited. The night came with a heavy wind, rattling the old shutters and pressing rain against the windows like tiny fists. Margaret's house smelled faintly of the bread she had baked earlier, its warmth mixing with the scent of candle wax she kept, lit beside the radio. Tonight, the ritual felt different, though she couldn't explain why. Her hands hovered over the dials, fingers trembling slightly as anticipation coiled in her chest. She adjusted the antenna with meticulous care, leaning forward, listening intently to the static that had been her constant companion for months. The hum of the radio was louder tonight, almost vibrating through the wood of the table, and for the first time in weeks, She felt a flicker of excitement she hadn't allowed herself before. Margaret's heart raced as she scanned the frequencies. She had memorized, each one a pathway she imagined Daniel could traverse. Hours passed, her posture stiff, her eyes unblinking, yet she did not leave. The storm outside intensified, thunder cracking against the roof, rain hammering in waves. Every gust of wind and flash of lightning seemed to echo the tension she felt inside. Then she heard it. A faint rhythm, almost imperceptible, buried within the static. It was subtle, a slight modulation she might have dismissed on any other night, but tonight she caught it. Her breath hitched. Could it be? She held perfectly still, straining to detect the pattern. 3 short pulses, deliberate, precise. Her heart leapt, and tears sprang to her eyes. She clutched the radio, fearing she might wake from a dream if she let go. Her hands shook as she whispered aloud, "Daniel, is that you?" The sound faded quickly, leaving her with the oppressive static once more. She leaned closer, her ear nearly pressed to the device, holding her breath as if inhaling courage directly from the radio. She could not know for certain, but she chose to believe. Margaret's mind raced. She recalled every promise Daniel had whispered on the night. He left, every word etched into her memory. "If you're listening, I'll find a way." Now, after months of waiting, it seemed that promise might be fulfilled. The thought carried a strange, dizzying mix of relief, joy, and fear. She had to remain cautious. Too much hope could shatter if the signal faded again, but she allowed herself a flicker of faith. Sleep was impossible. She sat upright, adjusting the dials repeatedly, listening with every fiber of her being. The storm continued, battering the house with ferocity, but she barely noticed. Each pulse she thought she heard became more distinct, etched into her consciousness like a rhythm she could not forget. She whispered words of encouragement, speaking as if Daniel could hear her across the miles. Meanwhile, Daniel and his team were miles away, navigating a terrain that seemed unending and unforgiving. Their mission had intensified, and the extraction plan was approaching. The desert had grown colder at night, sandstorms more frequent, each obstacle demanding sharper focus, deeper stamina, and absolute discipline. Yet Daniel carried with him the thought of Margaret's vigil. It anchored him, reminding him why survival mattered beyond duty or training. He remembered the nights spent imagining the radio, the 3-tone signal, the hope that it would pierce through the vast distance separating them. He knew that precision was critical. The slightest error could render the signal meaningless. His training as a SEAL had honed him for impossible tasks, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of knowing a single mistake could crush his mother's hope. Back at home, Margaret's vigil intensified as she attempted to decode the faint pulses. She counted them meticulously. 1, 2, 3, pause. Again. 1, 2, 3. Her tears fell freely now, a mix of relief and disbelief. Could this really be happening? She whispered his name, trembling, and adjusted the dials again, hoping for clarity. The radio vibrated faintly beneath her hands, as if responding to her desire to connect. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her heart. Lightning illuminated the room, shadows dancing across the walls. Every crack of thunder seemed to punctuate her heartbeat, every gust of wind an exclamation. Yet she remained steadfast. She could not leave. She could not falter. This was the night she had been waiting for, the moment she had imagined countless times, and she would not let it slip away. As the hours dragged on, Margaret realized the signal was not constant. It came in fleeting bursts, so brief she might have missed them if her attention faltered. But each time it came, she confirmed it in her mind. The pattern was deliberate, unmistakable. It was him. The thought sent waves of energy through her body. She pressed a hand to her chest, gasping, as if physically holding on to life itself. Her phone lay forgotten on the counter, her neighbors unaware of the breakthrough occurring within her home. Margaret did not call anyone. This moment was hers, a private communion that no outsider could understand. The letters, the prayers, the months of vigil all culminated in this small but powerful proof. Her son was alive, and he had reached her in the only way possible. In the distance, Daniel's extraction plan was coming together. The team had cleared the immediate threat zone, moving stealthily toward a location where communication was possible. Every decision was calculated. Every movement carried risk. The thought of Margaret's waiting eyes, of her unwavering belief, pushed him forward. He imagined her listening intently, adjusting the dials, holding on to the pulses he had secretly. Arranged, the knowledge that she would hear him kept him alive, even in moments when exhaustion threatened to consume him. Margaret spent the rest of the night alternately counting the pulses, jotting notes, and whispering reassurances to the static. She hummed tunes Daniel loved as a boy, believing that somehow the vibrations might carry across continents. Her hands were raw from adjusting the dials, her eyes bloodshot from hours of strain. Yet she remained alert, determined not to miss a single message. Each pulse was proof, each moment of victory against the relentless anxiety that had plagued her for so long. The storm gradually subsided, leaving the night calm and still. Yet Margaret could not rest. The signal had ceased for now, but she knew it would return. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. The months of waiting, of silent prayer, of tireless vigilance were not in vain. She had glimpsed hope, fragile and fleeting, but undeniable. As dawn approached, the first rays of light filtered through the blinds, painting the room in soft gold. Margaret remained in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. She leaned back, exhaling deeply, allowing herself a brief moment to savor the breakthrough. Somewhere, far away, Daniel had ensured she knew he was alive. And though she could not see him, could not touch him, the radio had bridged the impossible distance between them. The next hours would be critical. Margaret knew she must remain ready. The signal might resume, or it might be delayed. Every heartbeat carried tension. Every breath carried vigilance. She would continue to wait, to listen, to believe. The first whisper of hope had arrived, but the journey was not over. The real proof, the reunion, was still ahead. And so Margaret remained, watching, listening, waiting. The night air pressed heavily against Margaret's windows, thick with the promise of rain yet again. She sat upright in her chair, hands poised over the radio, as if it were an extension of her own body. Her eyes, bloodshot from countless nights of vigil, scanned the frequencies, listening for anything that might hint at Daniel's presence. Months of waiting had worn her body thin, but her determination burned brighter than ever. Tonight, she could feel that something was different. The storm that had threatened the town earlier had passed, leaving a strange stillness in its wake. The cicadas were quiet, the usual rustle of leaves muted. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting with her. Margaret's hands adjusted the antenna, tilting it slightly, then holding it steady as she leaned forward. Every sensation was heightened, the hum of the radio, the faintest crackle of static, the rhythmic beating of her heart. And then she heard it again. A signal, unmistakable this time. 3 short pulses, deliberate and precise, echoing faintly through the static. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her ear closer to the radio, trembling. Could it really be him? Her hand flew to her chest as tears blurred her vision. The pulses repeated, each one a lifeline stretching across continents, bridging oceans and deserts, reaching her. She whispered his name, barely daring to believe it. Daniel. Is that you? The pulses paused, then returned in the same pattern. She counted carefully. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Her trembling fingers traced the table, grounding herself. This was no mistake, no accident. Daniel was alive. He had found a way to send her proof, and she had received it. Margaret's mind raced as she processed the reality of the signal. Her body ached from months of vigil, yet she felt invigorated. The radio was no longer just a hum in the background of her life. It was a conduit, a thread connecting her to her son in a way letters and official updates never could. She whispered to the device, her voice trembling with relief and disbelief. "I hear you, Daniel. I hear you." Far away, Daniel moved with precision, his team navigating treacherous terrain toward a communications point. The extraction plan had been delayed multiple times due to unforeseen threats, but the pulses he had arranged were already on their way, piercing the atmosphere toward home. He imagined Margaret waiting by the radio, her hands steady despite exhaustion, her mind fixed on every detail of the sound. The thought kept him moving, gave him purpose, and reminded him why every grueling step mattered. Back at home, Margaret replayed the sequence in her mind. She jotted notes on a scrap of paper, careful not to lose track of the rhythm. Each pulse reinforced hope. Each sequence strengthened the fragile thread connecting mother and son. Sleep was impossible. She had no desire to rest. Rest could wait. This was the moment she had been waiting for all her life. Months of solitude, fear, and prayer had led to this proof, and she would not squander it. The storm had left the sky clear, revealing stars she had long forgotten to notice. She looked up briefly, imagining Daniel beneath the same night sky, somewhere in a world of danger, thinking of her. The thought was almost unbearable in its intensity, a mix of longing and relief, fear and faith. Yet she held on, letting the pulses anchor her, letting the rhythm soothe and guide her heart. As the hours wore on, the pulses continued sporadically, each appearance a confirmation that Daniel was alive, moving, and thinking of her. Margaret adjusted the dials repeatedly, careful to capture every detail. The signals were weak but consistent, their subtle pattern unmistakable. Her chest ached, from a mixture of exhaustion and elation, tears streaming freely down her face. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, hope had tangible form. Margaret's neighbors remained oblivious. They did not understand why she sat there hour after hour, night after night. They would have mocked her if they knew she had just received proof of life, proof that her son had survived unthinkable dangers. But this moment was sacred, private, and unshareable. It belonged to her and Daniel alone. The radio had transformed from an instrument of waiting into a bridge of love and survival. Meanwhile, Daniel's mission grew more perilous. Enemy patrols and treacherous terrain slowed the team, forcing careful recalculations and constant vigilance. Each moment carried potential death, but each step brought him closer to the point where he could safely transmit the signals. The extraction was no longer a distant plan, it was imminent. And every pulse sent across the ether carried not just his presence, but a message. He was alive, he was aware, and he was thinking of her. Back at the house, Margaret embraced every detail. The pattern of the pulses, their timing, the subtle shifts in frequency, all of it became a map of reassurance. She memorized the rhythm, whispering it aloud to herself, committing it to memory. These signals were more than proof. They were a dialogue, silent but profound, a mother and son conversing across unimaginable distance. The night wore on. They rained from earlier, replaced by a gentle breeze that rustled the leaves outside. Margaret barely noticed. Her world had contracted to the room, the chair, the radio, and the faint, insistent pulses echoing proof of Daniel's survival. She spoke softly into the room, into the static, into the space where she imagined him listening. I'm here. Daniel, I've always been here. The hours blurred into one another. Fatigue gnawed at her muscles, but the pulses kept her awake, alert, alive. Each time they returned, she felt a surge of energy, a physical reminder that her son had endured, that he was near enough to send her a message, if not in person, then in code. The wait had transformed into vigilance, and vigilance had become celebration. Daniel, far away, continued to move with calculated precision. Every decision was guided by experience, by instinct, and by the knowledge that Margaret was waiting. Each step taken, each threat evaded, each pulse sent, was a testament to the bond between mother and son. The extraction was drawing near, and with it, the promise that this vigil, this endless waiting, would finally bear fruit. Margaret's heart felt too full for her chest. The fear that had shadowed her for months was still present, lurking beneath the surface, but it was tempered by hope. The radio had spoken. Daniel had reached her, and she would remain, waiting for every pulse, listening for every signal, until the moment came when she could embrace him in reality, no longer separated by miles, danger, or uncertainty. As dawn approached, casting a soft glow through the windows, Margaret allowed herself a brief pause. She leaned back in the chair, exhausted but exhilarated. Her eyes rested on the radio, the pulses now imprinted on her memory, each beat a lifeline, a promise kept. She whispered once more softly into the quiet room, "I hear you, Daniel, always." And somewhere, far away, Daniel continued his journey, sending each pulse, moving toward home, toward the mother who had waited faithfully through storms, loneliness, and fear. Each signal was a bridge, a lifeline, a promise, the proof that love could traverse oceans, deserts, and danger. And Margaret, heart beating in sync with those faint pulses, remained steadfast, unwavering, and ready for the moment that would change everything. Margaret barely slept that night. She sat in the same worn armchair, hands hovering over the radio, listening with the intensity of a woman holding the weight of the world on her shoulders. The faint pulses had grown stronger, clearer, as if Daniel was finally close enough to make himself known. Each signal was a lifeline, a promise confirmed, and yet the waiting was unbearable. The fear of missing even a single beat gnawed at her, though she would never admit it aloud. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the night air crisp, almost impossibly still. The wind whispered against the windows, carrying a faint chill, yet Margaret barely noticed. Her world had contracted to the glow of the radio, the hum of the static, and the rhythmic pulses that promised life beyond the miles and dangers. She could feel the tension in her body, her muscles taut with anticipation, her eyes wide with unyielding focus. Each pulse told a story. Margaret had learned to interpret them, memorizing every subtle shift in frequency and timing. They were his voice now, a code she had waited months to hear, each one confirming that Daniel was alive, moving, and thinking of her. She whispered to herself softly, reverently, "Keep going, Daniel. I'm listening. I'm here. Miles away, Daniel." And his teen moved with painstaking precision. The extraction point was within reach, but the path was fraught with danger. Enemy patrols prowled unseen, and terrain that had seemed manageable days ago had shifted into a labyrinth of threat. Each step was measured, each breath controlled, every glance scanning for danger. But the thought of Margaret waiting, her unwavering vigil, gave him courage beyond measure. The pulses he had arranged were no longer subtle. They had become deliberate, insistent, a rhythmic signal he hoped would carry across the oceans to her waiting ears. Every transmission was a promise, a heartbeat, a thread tying him to the mother who had kept him alive in spirit, while the desert sought to claim him physically. He imagined her, leaning over the radio, listening intently, waiting for confirmation. That thought steadied him more than any training or weapon could. Back at home, Margaret's heart raced. The signals had intensified. Each sequence was unmistakable. Repeated, deliberate. Her fingers traced the table, trembling, grounding herself in the reality of what she was hearing. This was no illusion, no trick of the imagination. Daniel was alive. Daniel was close. And the reunion, long dreamt of, was finally within reach. The hours stretched, yet Margaret remained steadfast. She drank only water, nibbled at bread, yet could not leave the chair. Sleep was impossible, unnecessary. Each pulse was a lifeline. She could not afford to abandon. She whispered over and over, "I hear you, Daniel. I hear you." Her voice was hoarse, yet each repetition reinforced the reality. Proof had arrived. The night outside deepened. Shadows stretched across the walls, cast by the faint glow of the candle she had lit hours earlier. Margaret's eyes were locked on the radio. Every crackle, every hiss, every tiny flicker in the static, a potential signal. Her pulse matched the rhythm she now recognized as his pattern. She leaned forward, holding her breath, counting the 3. Short pulses again and again. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. She could barely contain the swell of emotion rising in her chest. Daniel's team navigated the last obstacles. Every step brought danger, yet also brought hope closer. The extraction point was visible, a small clearing marked with equipment pre-positioned to aid their escape. Daniel's pulse raced, but it was not fear, it was anticipation, the sharp thrill of approaching home. He imagined Margaret, waiting, as she always had, heart aligned with his, ready to hear his proof of life. Every movement, every decision, was made with her in mind. Margaret, meanwhile, felt a strange clarity. Months of waiting had honed her senses, sharpened her awareness. She could almost see him in her mind, moving through deserts, threading through dangers, sending her messages she could now interpret with near certainty. The static no longer seemed random. It had become a language, a secret conversation between mother and son. She whispered a prayer, her voice barely audible. "Please, Daniel, be safe. Come home." And then, as if in response, the pulses grew stronger, more deliberate, more confident. Margaret's heart soared. The storm inside her, the months of fear, the nights of loneliness, was breaking. Proof had arrived, undeniable and radiant. Daniel finally reached the extraction point. The team moved with speed, yet caution, avoiding detection, securing the perimeter. The communications officer activated the device that would send a final, unmistakable signal to Margaret, a sequence she could not misinterpret. 3 short pulses, repeated over and over, designed to pierce the static, to carry across oceans, and to tell her without doubt that he was alive and near safety. Margaret's ears caught it immediately. The pattern was unmistakable. She clutched the radio, tears streaming freely. Her knees shook, her chest a thunderstorm of emotions. The impossible had become real. Daniel was alive. He had survived. He was communicating. And after months of endless waiting, she would finally know the proof she had longed for. She whispered over and over, almost incoherently, "I hear you, Daniel. I hear you. I hear you." Her tears fell on the radio, on the table, on the notes she had kept, chronicling every vigil, every moment of silent hope. She had waited for this, and now the universe had responded. Outside, dawn began to break, casting soft gold light across the room. Margaret could barely see it through her tears. The radio continued to hum, each pulse now more confident, more insistent. It was as if Daniel's spirit had reached across the miles, pressing life into her weary hands, affirming the bond they had nurtured across distance, danger, and time. Daniel and his team were moments away from leaving the field entirely, heading toward transport that would take him closer to home. The pulses transmitted one last time, deliberate and unmistakable. Margaret's hands gripped the table, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Every heartbeat, every nerve in her body screamed, "He's coming home." And in that suspended moment, between night and dawn, between static and signal, Margaret realized something profound. Her vigil, her patience, her unwavering faith had bridged the impossible. The radio was no longer just a device. It was a lifeline, a bridge, a confirmation that love could survive distance, danger, and time. Her eyes burned, but she could not look away. She whispered once more, "I hear you, Daniel. Always, always." The pulses seemed to respond, steady and true, carrying a rhythm that could only belong to him. Margaret's world had narrowed to this one truth. Proof had arrived, danger was behind him, and the reunion she had longed for, prayed for, and imagined endlessly was finally within reach. The early morning sun spilled gold across Margaret's living room, illuminating the radio that had become her constant companion for months. The hum of the device had always been comforting, but now, after countless nights of waiting, it carried a different energy, a rhythm she could feel pulsing through her body. 3 short tones echoed repeatedly, steady, deliberate, and unmistakable. Daniel was close, alive. Margaret's heart raced as she clutched the radio, tears streaming freely. Every muscle in her body trembled with anticipation and relief. 4 months she had been trapped in the tension between hope and fear, listening to static and imagining signals that might not exist. But now, proof was undeniable. The pulses were real. He was real. She struggled to stand, unsteady on her legs, her entire body shaking with the surge of emotion. Memories of the long nights, the letters with blacked-out lines, the prayers whispered in darkness, all of it converged in a single overwhelming truth. He had survived. Her son had endured the impossible, and he was coming home. Daniel, far away, had reached the extraction point. The final coordination with his team was complete, and the device transmitting the pulses ensured that Margaret would not doubt the proof of his survival. The desert, which had been relentless and merciless, now seemed almost like a distant memory, softened by the promise of reunion. Every step he took toward safety carried not just the weight of survival, but the weight of her unwavering faith. Margaret gathered her coat, still clutching the radio, and moved toward the door, almost forgetting the world outside. She imagined Daniel stepping out of the desert, tired, dust-covered, but alive. The thought brought a shiver of both excitement and apprehension. After months of vigil, of endless nights spent listening to static and imagining patterns, the final moment, the moment when hope would become reality, was within reach. Outside, the morning air was cool, crisp, and alive with possibility. Margaret's eyes scanned the horizon, her breath catching at every passing car, every distant shadow, convinced that any one of them might carry her son home. Her hands trembled, and she clutched the radio tightly, as though it might guide him to her. The 3 short pulses repeated faintly through the device, and she whispered softly, "I hear you, Daniel. I'm here." Daniel's extraction had gone smoothly, the team moving with military precision. Every step toward the helicopter, every careful maneuver through the terrain, carried the promise that Margaret's waiting would soon be rewarded. The thought of her long months of vigil, her unwavering faith, the love that had sustained him across continents, pulled him forward more strongly than any training, any mission, or any danger. The radio's pulses began to fade slightly. As the distance closed, Margaret's pulse quickened. The sound, once the sole lifeline across oceans, would soon be replaced by the sight of her son. She held her breath, her hands trembling with the impossible mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Months of fear, longing, and prayer had led to this moment. Then she saw him. At the edge of the street, emerging from the early morning mist, was a figure she knew instantly. Dust clung to his uniform. His boots carried the imprint of a harsh journey. But his eyes, those familiar, unwavering eyes, were fixed on her. Margaret gasped, unable to contain herself, and ran. Her legs, weak from months of anticipation and sleepless nights, carried her forward, unstoppable. Daniel saw her before she reached him. His exhaustion melted away as relief and love surged through him. He broke into a run, meeting her halfway, closing the distance that had stretched across deserts and months of waiting. When they collided, Margaret wrapped her arms around him with a ferocity born of longing, fear, and uncontainable joy. Daniel pressed his face into her shoulder, inhaling the scent of home, of warmth, of the mother who had waited tirelessly for his return. A world contracted to that embrace. Months of separation, of fear, of uncertainty, dissolved into tears, whispered words, and the fierce heartbeat of reunion. Margaret clung to him, as though releasing him even for a moment would allow him to vanish again. Daniel held her tightly, murmuring promises, apologies, and gratitude. Their voices mingled in the quiet dawn, blending joy, relief, and disbelief into a single, unbroken chord. Finally pulling back slightly, Margaret searched his face, memorizing every detail. He was real. He had survived. He was here. And yet, the weight of the months of waiting remained, a quiet acknowledgement that the journey had not been easy for either of them. Her hands traced his face, lingering on the features that had grown stronger, yet still carried the echoes of love. Boyhood she remembered. Daniel's voice, steady but thick with emotion, whispered into the quiet morning. "Mom, you waited." "I always wait," Margaret replied, tears flowing freely. "Always. And I always will." The radio sat on the table, forgotten in the moment, its pulses now replaced by the reality of presence, of touch, of life returned. Yet Margaret could not help but glance at it, a tender smile crossing her face. That small device had been there. Bridge, their lifeline, their connection through impossible distance. And now it had delivered the most precious proof imaginable. Daniel had survived, and he was home. Neighbors began to stir, noticing the rare figure in the street. But Margaret paid no attention. The world beyond her son's arms had become irrelevant. The months of worry, of watching, of listening, had culminated in this single, miraculous moment. Every sleepless night, every anxious glance at the horizon, every whisper into the static, had led to the impossible becoming real. Daniel gently pulled back, holding her at arm's length to look into her eyes. "You kept faith," he said. "Even when it was impossible." "I had to," Margaret replied, her voice trembling. "You needed me to." He smiled, a mixture of exhaustion and relief, and rested his forehead against hers. "I heard you, Mom. I knew you were there." In that instant, all the months of waiting, of silent vigil beside a humming radio, of fear and hope intertwined, became irrelevant. The distance, the dangers, the uncertainty, all of it, melted away in the sheer, uncontainable reality of reunion. Margaret's arms tightened once more, and Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the warmth, the presence, the unwavering love he had imagined across deserts and oceans. Time seemed suspended as they stood together, mother and son, the world outside, fading into insignificance. And though the road ahead would still hold challenges, the unbroken connection of love, hope, and faith had triumphed. The radio, that constant companion, remained on the table, its silence a testament to the proof it had delivered, the lifeline it had maintained across impossible miles. Margaret finally allowed herself to speak, softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're home. You're really home." Daniel nodded, resting his head against hers once more. "Because you never stopped waiting." They held each other, letting the reality sink in, tears mingling, hearts beating in perfect unison. Months of separation, of tension, of relentless waiting had brought them to this single, extraordinary moment. Proof had become presence. The signal had become a voice. And finally, the mother who had waited beside the radio and the son who had survived unspeakable danger were together again. The morning sun rose higher, filling the room with light. Margaret and Daniel, exhausted but overwhelmed with relief, remained locked in each other's embrace, the past months of fear and hope dissolving in the simple, unshakable truth. They were together, and nothing could take that away.